Okay, we've got lots of people streaming in. Fabulous. Why don't we go ahead and get started? Pete, I'll turn it over to you, and then I'll take back the microphone when you're ready.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council program focusing on refugees and immigrants and how their stories and experience inform public policy. My name is Pete Damiano, Director of the University of Iowa Public Policy Center, and really appreciate your interest in this important topic, and particularly our speakers who are here, Art Cullen, Caleb Knutson, Kara McFerrin, and Christina Ortiz, for them sharing their perspectives on this important issue. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Public Policy Center, we're in the Office of the Vice President of Research in the Central Administration of the University. And so our job is really campus-wide to both do research around policy relevant topics, and then we've got an engagement mission, which is to share that information with policymakers and the public. And this event really falls under that. And we really appreciate the ability to collaborate with the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council on this. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Peter Gerlach, who will introduce the event and the rest of our speakers.
Thanks so much. I am Peter Gerlach, Project Director for our program series on refugees and immigrants in Iowa. I'm also a member of ICFRC's board and host for today's program. This is the final of 6 programs in ICFRC's series on refugees and immigrants in Iowa. ICFRC has provided this series as a catalyst for discussing issues that could lead to positive social change in our state, both for new residents and those who have been here for years, even decades. We believe the experiences and the stories shared by refugees and immigrants can and should inform public policy, creating the kind of discussions that can provide valuable information for policymakers and, of course, the general public as well. We are grateful to the Humanities Iowa and the National Endowment for the Humanities for their funding for this project. We would also like to acknowledge and thank our annual donors, sponsors, and partners for their support. The Iowa Arts Council through the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs, the University of Iowa's International Programs Honors Program, Public Policy Center, and Center for Human Rights, the Stanley UI Foundation for Support Organization, Midwest One Bank, City Channel 4, and the UI Library Archives. ICFRC has adopted the Native American Land Acknowledgement prepared for the City of Iowa City's Ad Hoc Truth and Reconciliation Commission and Human Rights Commission. We recognize that our home of Iowa City now occupies the homelands of Native American nations to whom we owe our commitment and dedication. The full text of our acknowledgement is on our website at icfrc.org. As we get started, I would like to cover some Zoom etiquette tips. We have muted all of you so that there won't be any background noise for the speakers. We ask that you please keep your video turned off for the duration of the presentation. Following our speakers' presentations at about 1:15, we will have a 15-minute Q&A. You'll be able to submit your questions via the chat function. At that time, we invite you to turn on your video, but we'll keep you muted. So it is now my pleasure to introduce our speakers who will talk about how the stories and experiences of refugees and immigrants inform public policy. Art Cullen is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, editor of the Storm Lake Times, a family-run weekly newspaper, and author of the new book, Storm Lake, A Chronicle of Change, Resilience, and Hope from a Heartland Newspaper. Art has made it his life's work to ask the big questions, speak truth to power, and share the struggles and successes of his unique community of Iowa, population 10,076. His new book is part cultural history, part memoir. It explores the themes of family, community, immigration, and diversity, the meaning of home, and the Heartland's turbulent history and promising progressive future. Drawing from the times when Americans from red and blue states often feel estranged from each other, Art's book attempts to show an optimistic way forward, that there is still abundant hope in the Heartland. Caleb Knudsen was born in Honduras and grew up in rural Iowa. Currently, he is the senior planner for Mid-Iowa Planning Alliance. He and his wife also operate their family startup coffee shop in Story City. He studied criminology and criminal justice, as well as community and regional planning at Iowa State University. Caleb serves on the Empower Rural Iowa Growth Task Force, Iowa Commission of Latino Affairs, and the Iowa American Planning Association Board, where he co-chairs its Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. He resides in rural Hardin County with his wife and their children and numerous pets. Kara McFerrin is an artist, businesswoman, wife, mother, elected official, and third-generation Mexican-American. Born in the Midwest, she grew up in Davenport, Iowa. In 1992, she received her BFA from the College of Design at Iowa State University. In 1997, she and her husband moved to West Liberty, thereby beginning their journey into small-town rural living. In 2015, Kara was the first Mexican-American woman to be elected to West Liberty's City Council. In 2019, she was elected for a second term. She is one of 5 council members, all at large, and as of 2021, a member of Iowa's first city council to have a majority of Latino members. Currently, she and her husband are very busy raising a son and operating their own business, Cardinal Sign and Graphics, a vinyl graphics company. And Christina Ortiz is an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Minnesota Morris, where she also contributes to the Latin American area studies and gender, women, and sexuality studies programs. Her research interest began as an effort to understand her own heritage as the grandchild of Mexican-American migrant workers who settled in the Midwest. She is broadly interested in issues of rurality, belonging, ethnic identities, labor, and migration. Her research explores the everyday experiences of rural Midwesterners with a particular focus on communities with Latinx and immigrant residents. Please join me in welcoming our Cullen, Caleb Knudsen, Kara McFerrin, and Christina Ortiz. Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to have you all here, and it's wonderful to have a robust attendee group as well. So to begin, I would like to note, as in all of our programs in this series, we acknowledge that people's experiences can vary greatly because they come from different walks of life. So those who are refugees, immigrants, asylees, those who are documented or undocumented, those who have familial or friendship ties in the area, those who do not have those ties, those who have children, those who are children or descendants of newer Iowans. And so my first question and the answers to it demonstrate the importance of this point. So separate from what I've read aloud here to the group in your bios and in your own words, would each of you share your migration story to Iowa? And perhaps Art, I'll begin with you. Would you share your migration story to Iowa with us?
Well, I was born in Storm Lake, so that's how I migrated here via a stork. Actually, I'm 100% Irish American. My ancestors were involved in driving the Winnebago out of the land near Dubuque, the 10,000 Irishmen who came up the Mississippi River and drove the native people out of the lead mines near Dubuque. Other ancestors who settled the prairie out here in western Iowa, northwest Iowa, which is actually part of South Dakota, and or is regarded as such. And they too drove the native people out. They were immigrants and drove the resident people out who had driven the previous resident people out. The Iowa were driven out by the Sac and Fox, and later the Dakota. And then my Irish ancestors came through and then drove them out. And so that's sort of the story of immigration in Iowa. Dominion.
You locate yourself very much within that history, yeah, being from Storm Lake. Kara, I'll turn to you. Your own migration story to Iowa?
Better unmute myself here. Yes, thank you for inviting me. My story goes for generations, actually. For me, I am a third generation born Mexican-American here in the Midwest and fourth generation to settle in Iowa. My great-grandparents immigrated up from Mexico. They followed the railroad. So around 1908, they went up through El Paso, Texas, Peabody, Kansas, and eventually settling in West Liberty here, where my grandfather found work on the Rock Island Railroad. He was a section lineman. He retired in 1939. My grandfather, that was my great-grandfather. My grandfather was born here in West Liberty in 1913. And in 1933, he happened to be the first Latino to graduate from West Liberty High School. So my mother was born here. So we have kind of a long-standing history here in West Liberty. Although I didn't grow up in West Liberty, I grew up close by. So West Liberty as a child for me was very much 308 North Church Street. It was kind of circled back when my husband and I decided, we found a home and decided to move here in 1997. And we've been very involved ever since. So it is kind of interesting how my immigration story has transcended through the years from the early 1900s until now. So, and my paternal side of the family also immigrated from Mexico, and they headed up and settled originally in Horton, Kansas. And then from there, they moved to Silvis, Illinois, and some moved to Chicago area. And so Midwest living was very common for my ancestry. And it was predominantly brought on from the railroad because the railroad was very, needed that workforce, very prolific.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you. Christina, I'll turn to you. Would you share your own migration story too, and then maybe now from Iowa?
Sure. I have to start with a disclaimer. I am finishing up my last few weeks of a position at the University of Iowa VA. And so I have to say that nothing that I say represents the VA or the federal government in any way. Start there.
Very good.
So this research was something that I undertook as a graduate student. And I got into research about Latinx people in the Midwest because of my family heritage. My grandparents were migrant workers who settled in northern Iowa and have a sort of similar history to what Kara was describing. Working on the railroad and in meatpacking plants and in clothing manufacturing. And those stories unfolded in Iowa that had a Latino community around them. My dad grew up with what I would call a Latino community. And I did not grow up with that. My dad married my mother, who's not Latina, and they lived in places that did not have lots of Latinos. And so my experience of being Latinx and very light-skinned and not speaking very much Spanish growing up was very different from the experience my dad and grandfather and grandmother had as Latinx people and the ideas that they had about what that meant and what constituted that. And so I was really curious about how all our stories are a part of being Iowan and what it means to be Iowan. And so although anthropologists typically go to very far away sort of places, I went relatively close to home and lived in Columbus Junction for a few years. And unbeknownst to me, I actually had family on the non-Latinx side of my family who lived in Columbus Junction, but I didn't know that when I decided to go move there.
Well, in what you said, you pinpointed exactly why I asked this question. I not only asked this question to, to all the panelists on this, in this series, but I also ask it when folks visit my class, which I teach in the spring every year, which is also about refugees and immigrants in Iowa. Caleb, to you, perhaps the furthest away to Iowa, would you share your migration story with us?
Yeah, so first, it's an honor to be here. Thank you so much. This is a fantastic panel. I'm excited. I was born in Tegucigalpa, Honduras. It's the capital of Honduras. I left Honduras when I was 4, so my memories of Honduras aren't great. I've been there as an adult. I grew up in rural Iowa, and like many people, all Iowa's rural. I'll say that, but growing up in rural Iowa, I was the only Latino in my class. It was a small 1A school or A school, depending on the sport. And so I was the diversity. Being Afro-Latino, one year I would select Hispanic on the basic skills test, and the next year I would select Black just to mess with the school. It was my form of protest of being the only person of color in my grade. And so when I got of age to leave, at 18, 19, I moved. I went west. I went to Colorado, lived there for a while, and met my wife. And, I'm a boomerang. So I came back to Iowa, and I'm back in Iowa. I love it. And it's something that I have made conscious decisions about with my own kids. If their class isn't diverse, how can we do that? How can I encourage them to look in their culture? And not just during Hispanic Heritage Month, not just, with watching Coco or Encanto. How can we pour into ourselves and the community that we're in? And in my migration story, it's making sure that stories are being told, making sure that the people around us see us and hear us, because the different cultures in Iowa, you might not think it's diverse, but it is. You go to a small community, there's going to be diversity, and it's going to be socioeconomical, it's going to be race and ethnicity, and it's going to be heritage, and every culture has something to bring to the table. And that's part of my migration story, and that's what drives me, is making sure that people's stories are heard and listened to.
Thank you, Caleb. You said it beautifully. Fabulous. What a great way to open us up. Our focus today is on how perceptions and policy about diversity and inclusion at the local level have evolved, and the part that refugees and immigrants have played in this evolution. These new residents have discovered new opportunities for personal, familial, and personal growth, and they have provided a needed workforce to support economic development in many of these communities, as well as the vibrancy of culture that benefits the community and the state. So in my first question, though, I'd like to locate us in each of your hometowns, and in your case, Christina, the site of your dissertation research, where you were living for a couple of years there. Would you each please share with us how and why the demographics of Columbus Junction, Marshalltown, Storm Lake, and West Liberty, the 4 focuses of our discussion today, have changed over the last few decades? Christina, I'd like to begin with you.
Sure. So Columbus Junction has had a population of about 2,000 people that's been pretty steady over the last few decades. Latinx people arrived there in large numbers in the 90s, but there had been Latinx, mostly seasonal agricultural workers, and some who settled out since at least the 1950s. Over time, of course, there are ebbs and flows, and communities like Columbus Junction really exist at the intersection of shifts in economic choices. So the decisions about meatpacking plants, about where to locate and how to recruit workers, and at the intersect of those decisions, and at the intersection of that with transnational political policies, right? So where people are maybe trying to leave from, and where people are looking for opportunities and where they're able to seek those. So not only US immigration policies have an impact, but also the economic and political policies of various other countries. And you can see those ebbs and flows. Mark Gray is an anthropologist at the University of Northern Iowa, and he has said before that you can't predict exactly what will happen in these ebbs and flows, but you can make some educated guesses, right? So like large numbers of Arabic Muslim refugees are not going to go to a place like Columbus Junction because the meatpacking plant, it focuses on pork, right? So you can kind of look at the world situation and make some educated guesses about what might happen. But certainly no one would have ever guessed that shortly after arriving in Columbus Junction in 2009 to live like I did, that there would be an arrival of 300 to 500 Chin Burmese refugees in the next 6 months. No one would have guessed that. And no one intended for that to happen. But that is what happened. And so these communities are at the intersection of these ebbs and flows that they don't really have an infrastructure to deal with. And yeah, I think I'll stop there. That's, yep.
Great, yeah, thank you, Christina. Yeah. Caleb, do you mind going next?
Yeah, what I'm going to say is very similar to Christina, not as scientific, but Marshalltown has a very similar trajectory. Meatpacking plant, a white collar community. And because of that, people have come, people have found jobs, people are able to make a life. And it's the informal networks that it has grown. When I think of Marshalltown, it's incredibly diverse for how small it is. There's just so much economic opportunity for the Latino community, for the Latino population. When I talk to people, I say, in Marshalltown, I can count on one hand that there are 5 different Latino grocery stores. And what does that say about the community? It says, one, that they're strong enough to support one, but they're able to do it with others. And so because of the meatpacking plants and because of, as everything Christina said, the community has continued to grow with the Latino population. And now there's other new immigrants, new populations coming. There's a couple of Asian grocery stores as well. And as a planner, those are things that I see as indicators, as economic indicators that are supporting the community. And so, I wonder what Marshalltown would look like without the meatpacking plant. What would the school been able to afford new additions and new things like that? Would the city be able to do new roads, new housing developments? And so when I think of this question, yes, I point to the community themselves, but I think of how strong of a foundation the immigrants have built and are keeping these communities alive.
Thank you, Caleb. Art, would you locate us in Storm Lake and tell us a little bit about how demographics have changed over the last few decades?
Well, I was born in 1957, and growing up here, there was one Jewish family in Storm Lake, and there was a black basketball player at Buena Vista College. That was it. And there was a gay hairdresser. And that was diversity in Storm Lake, Catholics and Lutherans and Presbyterians. That was diversity. If a Catholic married a Presbyterian, it was a big deal. In 1980, High Grade, the incumbent meatpacker, one of the big 4 at the time, closed in a labor dispute with the Amalgamated Meat Cutters Union over a $2 an hour pay raise. And back then, they were making the equivalent today of $125,000 a year with overtime, union members. High Grade closed down the plant in the dispute with the union. They waited a year, the union, which busted the union, and IBP came in and opened the plant, and the union members wouldn't work there, so they recruited people from Laos. And this was one of the original beachheads for the tie dam community. Here, Des Moines, to a lesser extent, I think Waterloo. And but this is the site of one of 4 Buddhist temples in the state. And it's gorgeous. It's this gold-leafed Buddhist temple sitting next to a ready-mix concrete plant. And that's how Storm Lake looks. And but there weren't, as the farm crisis ensued in the 1980s, there weren't enough Anglos everybody was leaving for Oklahoma and Texas. The rural Iowa was draining out of Anglos. And there weren't enough people that used to be that the meatpacking plants, farm boys would work at night while their dad owned the farm. They'd work the plant at night, and then eventually they'd take over the farm. But they all left. And so there was no workforce left. And so then they started recruiting, IBP started recruiting from Jalisco in Mexico, and from a town in particular called Ayatlan, which is about the same size as Storm Lake, about 10 to 15,000 people. We believe Storm Lake is now about 15,000 people. We're not sure because the census really can't count these immigrants accurately. But in 1990, they started recruiting from Jalisco. And in each wave, there was sort of a racist reaction. When the Asians first came, everybody said, well, weren't they the people we were fighting in Vietnam? Well, actually, they were the people that were working for the CIA in Cambodia. They were our guys. And so then once people figured that out, oh, okay, they were fighting on our side and they pay cash for a home, they're all right, and they worked their butts off. And so people respected that, they got used to it. Then in 1990, when they started bringing in young single Latino guys, and when you're cutting hogs all day or turkeys, you're going to go out and get drunk at night and you might get in a bar fight. That's the way meatpacking plants are. And it's brutal work. And so people said, oh, Jesus, we're being overrun by criminals, because there was a bunch of bar fights. And well, eventually these guys, found, women came up from Jalisco and they got married, they settled down, they quit drinking, going to the bar. That's how it works in a meatpacking town. And everybody then got used to the Latinos. By God, they family up 3 to a house and they pay cash, and they work their butts off. And so each time it takes 5 years or 10 years for everybody to get acculturated, and then you've got Sudanese, Somalis, people from Myanmar. There are 30 languages spoken in Storm Lake. 90% of our elementary school are children of color. And so it's been a complete transformation of Storm Lake. It's a non-union town. These workers really have no voice. It's been a complete transformation. Storm Lake has grown from when I was a kid from 5,000 to close to 15,000 now. And the school system has really led the way in managing the transformation of Storm Lake. With a very aggressive ESL program, about nearly 200 teaching assistants who are multilingual. And now we have a Spanish immersion program for students. So we've really managed it well. And with Iowa Central Community College, now you graduate from Storm Lake High School in 5 years with a AA degree or a VOTEC certificate. So these kids who are having trouble matriculating because of language problems and other issues, they're getting over a 90% graduation rate with a VOTEC degree among immigrant students. So I feel like, we've really worked through a lot of issues and a lot of confusion over the last 40 years. And we're getting to a place where we're starting to make some real progress.
Thanks, Art. And we'll dig down a little deeper into some of the things that you've talked about. But yeah, things have certainly changed from where you started your remarks. Indeed. Kara, let me turn to you next. Same question.
Yes, West Liberty has had a pretty long-standing history of immigration, and the generations have basically grown up together. So we have that benefit of having history. I remember my grandparents talking about when our county fairgrounds, which is located here in West Liberty, used to house Italian prisoners of war, and during World War II, and my grandfather would go up and talk to them across the fence, and at that time they would be playing soccer basically, and they would be able to communicate because he was bilingual and spoke Spanish, and then they spoke Italian, so they would be able to at least communicate on a basic degree. And then during that time, there was a cannery here in West Liberty that morphed over the years into what used to be Lewis Rich Foods, which is turkey processing plant. So my grandmother actually worked at Lewis Rich for a time while she was, after she had raised her kids, and would go in every morning early and work on the line, eventually working as on the line to make the boxes, to fold the boxes for packaging. And then she would come home and she would work at home. And currently now, Lewis Rich has been changed hands, and now it is no longer, and we have West Liberty Foods, which produces about 40% of the market, poultry market for turkey. And it employs around 900 employees. So each year they put out about 5 million process about 5 million birds a year. The plan ongoing is for the industry to build a new plant, which is working with the city and the citizens here to really have input all the way around in building and making it a community effort. A lot of their employees are immigrant employees, and a majority of them are from Spanish-speaking countries, but through the recent past, there has been a lot of sub-Saharan African nations that have brought in a workforce. Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudanese, Somalian. So it about 5 years ago, it wouldn't have been unusual. I thought it would be, but actually, when more I think of it, it wouldn't be unusual for me to walk down the streets of West Liberty, which only has a population of right around 4,000, maybe just a touch under, to see an Irishman walking in a kilt all on the same day, a huge birthday party in a backyard with piñatas and music and food from a Spanish-speaking community, and then a sub-Saharan African woman walking in traditional garb with coming out of the laundromat with a basket of her laundry on her head, walking back to her home. So that is, to me, that was amazing to see that diversity in our community. We attribute a lot of that actually to the success of the merging of cultures by the school district through our youth. We've been able to benefit from merging the cultures because we have a successful dual language program. And through the generations, actually, the kids, the youth, they grow up together, they go to school together, they continue the friendships together. And that's what brings a lot of our community together. there's still a distinction between the cultures that is always there, but we are as a community really trying to close that gap and enjoy and immerse all the cultures in our community.
Thank you, Kara. I mean, you've always described especially closer to the present here, a really rich, diverse Iowa, and in rural locations that many might be surprised to hear, as well as what you're also suggesting is the future looks even more diverse. Several of you have noted children, right? And going to school together, and what is normal, what is different, who the other is, seems to, in many ways, be changing quite a bit. Because when kids are just in school together, and that's who sits beside them in the classroom, or that's who they play with on the playground, there are fewer others, and they learn to, let's hope, in the schools, in the classrooms, be appreciating more difference, which I think is wonderful. You've all noted, I believe, meat packing or meat production in your towns, and that being really central. And the ways in which refugees and immigrants have been a big part of that. I'm intrigued, Art, when you noted that folks were recruited from this specific town in Mexico. I mean, there's an intentionality behind which employers have regrown their workforce. And that's a really important point. I mean, many of these—
a pipeline is established, and once you establish that pipeline, you don't need to advertise or tell anybody even about it. IBP wasn't letting anybody know back then what was going on, but these family connections are established, and now, of course, people are going back and forth all the time. So, but there was definitely, IBP was heavily recruiting anywhere it could to bring people into Storm Lake, and particularly from Jalisco, because it was a rural culture, and they adapted well. I mean, they adapted well because people, they were also recruiting in the south side of Chicago, and it was more of a culture shock for people from Chicago than it is for people from Jalisco to come to Storm Lake, honestly, because it's very laid back here by comparison, and it's just a whole different environment than an urban area in the U.S.
I have to say too, Carrie, your point about West Liberty Foods, Catherine Whitneben and I have heard from West Liberty Foods recently. They reached out because they hired around a dozen, I believe the number was, Afghan refugees. This is very recent, and wanted to get training, cultural sensitivity training, cultural appreciation training, so that these Afghan refugees would feel more welcome, and that the folks already there would know how to welcome and create a kind of environment where everyone would have a better work environment. And that to me says something as well. The ways in which we are progressing.
Absolutely. In fact, I wanted to stress the fact that although that's a benefit, it also can be a challenge too, because new immigration to our community does have some drawbacks, in that there's a large learning curve for the new immigrants to help and deal with like simple government procedures or formalities in dealing with applications, or having just to deal with our infrastructure that perhaps they have had not experience dealing with before, or experience in dealing with, the ability to have a voice in our government and our community. So that being said, we as a community I think it's to our advantage to be a small town community, because we do kind of share, a small town urbanization, I guess, if you call it, to assist one another and really reach out to the new immigrants.
So my next question, over this time, and let's especially say in the last decade, I'm wondering what have been some specific efforts, initiatives, policies, and or laws from elected officials and from community and business leaders in your respective towns that have been inclusive of and in partnership with refugee and immigrant populations. And I'm also wondering what the responses of those in the community have been. So I'm thinking here, some of the things you've touched on already: economic and employment related policies, social services, maybe healthcare, policing and law enforcement, childcare and education, refugee and immigrant integration assistance, things like that. Caleb, you're in the business of planning. Maybe you can speak to us a little bit first about what has been inclusive of and in partnership with refugee and immigrant populations in Marshalltown.
So when you have new populations come in, how they live and how they work is different than the Anglos. Art touched on this a little bit, and I think of it from a design. Many communities have a design guidelines. They got design standards. You go to Pella, everything's super Dutch. If doesn't matter if it's a mom and pop business or all the way to Walmart, they have to play that ball game. Now in Marshalltown, we're not able to do that, and we've got to think outside the box. Okay, just because we, and I'm saying we as in the majority, think these colors aren't great colors for a business, that doesn't mean that they're not good colors that you will see in Mexico City, in Tegucigalpa, in these other Latino cities, the vibrant colors. And so we've got to look at things not just from our perspective, but from the global perspective. And so a lot of times when there are design standards for community, I always ask, okay, who are those design standards for? When were they written? Because just because orange isn't a color you like to see in a business doesn't mean it's not going to go on a Latino grocery store or bodega, because they're going to have vibrant colors. They're going to have flags, and they're going to have things hanging around, and that's not less than, it's not anything more, and it's just different. And so, it's looking at it and making sure we're taking a step back and really being inclusive in how we're designing and how we're allowing things to be designed. Right now the state loves historical buildings. They want to be rebuilt, but does that make sense for every community? Does it make sense for a corner market to be historic 1910 Iowa instead of 19 what we are now? And so when we're developing and we're designing, let's make sure that we're taking in the people who are actually living, working, and our patrons there. And so that's from the government and planning perspective of it.
Christina, what would you say? What are some initiatives, some policies, laws even from local officials? We can say Columbus Junction. We can broaden a little bit too, certainly, that have been inclusive of and in partnership with refugee and immigrant communities.
Sure. So a couple of the things that really struck me as really productive were just after the arrival of Chin Burmese refugees in Columbus Junction, the community development officer called community leaders together to try to make sure that they were coordinating services and able to communicate with community members, and keeping those lines of communication open with new residents of the community, particularly those who didn't speak English very well, and sort of just try to, get everybody on the same page. And I thought that was a really great idea, because the meeting wasn't to do or accomplish anything in particular, but really showed an important element of care and concern for the well-being of new community members. And I just thought that was fantastic. And a key part of that was I would say, heroic efforts of small town librarians and the librarian in Columbus Junction in particular to be accessible, to provide services to people, internet access, to be a resource, to try to acquire literature, reading materials, anything in Hakka Chin, which at the time, maybe even still, did not have a single dictionary in print that went both English to Chin and Chin to English. There was only one, and it went only one direction. I can't remember which one that was right now. I think it was English to Chin. But imagine trying to learn a whole new language with a dictionary that doesn't even go backwards and forwards. So the librarian made just extraordinary efforts on, as you can imagine, a shoestring budget to, be accessible to new community members and make them feel welcome. And that's just fantastic. But overall, I think one of my concerns, and something that is a little bit different about Columbus Junction than some other communities like Marshalltown or West Liberty, is that the city leadership overall has taken a sort of laissez-faire approach to any sort of particular accommodations for immigrants and refugees, right? It's sort of like, get used to how we do things here. The children will figure it out. We just have to wait for the next generation, and then everybody will be fine. And I think that's a little bit problematic in a context where, particularly for Columbus Junction, there's a lot of turnover in community membership. So people who are really successful end up often going somewhere else. Sometimes they do the boomerang thing like Caleb was talking about, and coming back with their young families and settling there. But a lot of times people who are successful need to go somewhere else to, pursue their education, to pursue their careers. And so that means that a good portion of the community is always new. And so you perpetually have to be implementing these things about education and how we do things. And it doesn't have to be really big. One person can't make all the difference, but one person can make a huge difference. And so one of my favorite examples of this is I was helping people register for school. And one of the things that you have to sign as a parent is a thing that says, I understand that my kid can get a concussion on the playground, basically. Sign. For an American parent, no big deal, whatever. Because we kind of understand the context of like liability and state policy and whatever. Okay, no big deal. For a parent who doesn't speak English and maybe just moved here not that long ago, they had lots of questions about what this paper meant. And so providing a translated copy was not sufficient, right? I had to explain, does this mean, they had so many questions. Does this mean that my kid won't, an ambulance won't be called if my kid hits their head on the playground? Like, no, that's not what it means. But the requirement to have all the context of that one tiny signature explained was much bigger and required more resources than just a translated copy of the paper to sign. And so as policymakers, we need to think about, are we contextualizing these processes and institutional requirements in ways that make sense to people who maybe don't have all that contextual knowledge already?
That is such a fabulous example, Christina, because it really does point out that language translation is not enough. It doesn't stop there. Just because one might understand the literal words being said, it does almost times nothing for the broader context. What is actually being discussed here, and what implication does it have for you and your child? And certainly schools, as we've already touched on already, is really a place where so much of this is happening, right? And part of the reason that is because sometimes the parents may not be the primary English speakers. And so where does the responsibility lie? How much should a child be responsible for in communicating this broader understanding? And of course, then, what is the responsibility of policymakers, of elected officials, of the school administration? I wonder, Kara, from the vantage point of an elected official, how do you see this? What does it look like in West Liberty? Do you mind sharing an example or two of the ways in which West Liberty has been intentional, has been inclusive of refugee and immigrant populations? And maybe also touch on how folks responded to that.
Yes. Actually, I remember, if I could just jump onto what Christina said, very much early on, it was because of the language barrier, there was the real push for the children to step in to be sort of the intermediary between the adults and the government, or the adults and the, you know, corporation, or the healthcare provider, or whatever the situation was, because of that language barrier, because the children could be bilingual, but the parents didn't. So you had 8-year-olds trying to translate, you know, contracts and permission papers and so forth, very mature documents to their parents. Whereas now it is, in West Liberty at least, there's been a really concerted effort to try and work with this in getting a lot of not only documents and permits and so forth translated into other languages, but also to encompass a workforce here that also is bilingual, so that not only could you, you know, read something in another language, in your language, but you could also speak with somebody in your language as well. And so we've been fortunate enough to be able to have some of the workforce, whether it's been in the PD or department, or the city hall department, or some of the frontline workers with your city public works department, being able to have that ability to speak in another language, write in that language, or read in that language. So that, and plus around town, we have also been able to incorporate a lot of the signage in other languages as well. And that's pretty commonplace. I mean, you go into, for instance, the grocery stores, and you will see dual language signage, or you go into the parks and you'll see dual language signage. So we've been able to embrace it in that way, so that it isn't just the responsibility of one person or a young child to do the translation. So that has been one way we've been able to accommodate and really work with the communities. The fact that currently right now we have representation on our city council, out of 5 counselors, there's 4 that are Latin American ancestry or descendants, serving on city council, is pretty amazing to me. And so we've been able to really represent our minority population.
Yeah, it does make me wonder what our towns, what our cities would look like if the elected officials looked more like more representative of the population. And in West Liberty, that is actually the fact. And with so many changes happening to demographics, that is, more is needed in this area. More elected officials who don't look like me. Digging a little deeper and going sort of beyond what is going on in your respective towns, Art, I want to turn to you for this one. You were touching on it a bit in the first question. I'm wondering if each of you would say a little bit about what some of the difficulties have been, what you faced, and what are some of the primary challenges each of your communities will need to overcome into the future? I mean, speaking openly about things such as local complexities, racism and xenophobia, as well as the divisive and the complicated political landscape are, I think you will all agree, necessary in a discussion such as this one, and also the impacts of the pandemic locating us right here in 2022. So difficulties faced more recently and what you see as primary challenges into the future, Art, what would you say relative to, refugees and immigrants in Storm Lake?
Well, obviously the most important problem, challenge, whatever you want to call it, is our broken immigration system that's, founded in racism and fear. And, people have been scared in Storm Lake for many years. During two terms of the Obama administration, they were afraid of being deported. And during, the Trump administration, they were even more fearful of being deported. But don't let Obama off the hook. He chose not to pursue comprehensive immigration reform, and instead tried to fix it with the Band-Aid of executive orders. And that's a real lingering hardship here in Storm Lake, to create community when people are afraid to answer the door for the census taker, for example, because they're afraid of being deported. And that's real, and it's palpable. And then during the pandemic, the Trump administration, in conspiracy with the American Meat Institute and the governors of Nebraska, South Dakota, and Iowa, forced people into meat packing plants without PPE, without testing, certainly without vaccines, with very little disregard for them, because they're really not of us. And I believe that's a typical Iowa form of subtle racism that's practiced all the time. And we like to think more of ourselves, but subtle racism, it exists everywhere in Iowa. And it was on full display during the pandemic, I thought. And it's the Democrats could solve the Dreamers problem tomorrow. They could force Chuck Grassley to vote for it tomorrow, but they'd choose not to because it serves their interests. And the same with the Republican Party. It serves their interests to have these people in limbo. And they're both culpable. And it's a real problem in Storm Lake. The eyes and ears of the police department, we have community service officers who speak Lao and Spanish, two of them. And, the eyes and ears for them have gone underground now because they're afraid. And it's because of this cynical, broken immigration system that nobody's doing a goddamn thing about it, including the Dreamers. And it could be done tomorrow, but nobody cares.
I love that you get straight to the point, Art. No need to cut around corners. You're right. The fear is palpable, and it does increasingly feel like no one really does want to fix things. I say so many times now, the older I get, the more I struggle, I am troubled by the ways that humans are terrible to one another. And with respect to refugees and immigrants, you're right. I mean, there are people who benefit on both sides.
And with climate change, there's only going to be more people from Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala. Guatemala is going through an epic drought. The campesinos are broke. They're heading to the border in desperation, fleeing, terrorist violence from drug gangs and cartels. And we tell them to just sit there in Juarez and rot. It's your problem. You might have COVID. Stay the hell out of here. It's completely cynical, and it makes you wonder what the Statue of Liberty means.
Thank you, Art. Caleb, I'll turn to you next. Where do you want to take us from there? There are lots of problems. There are real challenges to overcome into the future. Art has, that's one of the big ones. He's described one of the big ones. What's your perspective?
Yeah, wow, Art with some truth bombs. I really appreciate that. That's going to be hard to follow. But, as he was talking, I was just writing some things down. And, from a community or economic point of view and just a human point of view, representation, I am so jealous of communities that have Latinos on city council. How lucky are they? How important is that? And the subtle racism that happens all the time. In Marshalltown, we had a brand new grocery store go up that the Iowa Economic Development Authority helped fund. Director Debbie Durham came and toured it. So this was a key piece in our community. And, people were super proud of it. And Anglo walked through and said, this place is too Mexican. Whoa, like in 2021. And so in that person's mind, they're like, wow, this is really nice, but this is too nice for this population. And so when you see or hear subtle racism, call it out, because this was a huge project for Director Durham to come. Man, that doesn't happen often. And how do we combat that? Representation, making sure we have people on all levels. And I don't just say it's about city council. Being a planner, I am very specific to that, but making sure that we have representation on Board of Adjustment, Plan Zoning Commission, Parks boards. That's how you get people involved. It wasn't until a couple of years ago that we had Latino representation on those. And now that we have it, it's something that we do have. And a lot of times I have seen barriers from the community, the Latino community to the city. And it's not, it's hard to explain the barriers, but it's just a comfort level. So, when I'm at the barbershop and someone's asking me about what can I do with my fence, just answer the questions. Making sure that we have those informal conversations are so important. When I'm at the grocery store with my family, not being mad or annoyed when someone asks me, hey, what is the rule for pools? Just be like, oh, if it's taller than 18 inches, you need a fence around it, type of thing. And making sure that we break down the barriers so that there's a comfort level to get involved, because those barriers are there, whether people want to say them or not, they're there. I have heard multiple times, well, they just don't want to get involved. First of all, who's the they? And why don't they want to get involved? Is it a language issue? Because Google Translate isn't that great. Is it a cultural issue? Like, do they feel welcome? So many times in my career of community and economic development, I've been the only person of color. My friend Jim Thompson at IEDA, he says you need people with different shoes under the table at the table with you. And that has meant so much to me. Because, I might be wearing Toms today or Jordans the next day, but making sure that there are people from different walks of life. And so whenever I'm in a room, making sure that I'm letting other people know they feel welcome and breaking down those barriers of, yes, we're with the city, we're with the government, but we're here to help you understand those rules. We don't want to come down on you because your fence is busted, because, you're parking in the grass, but here's why. So making sure that we're having honest to God conversations with people and not just coming down with the right hand of doom. Making sure that we're treating them like family, even if they're not. Making sure if their English is broken, how hard is it to think in two different languages? That's impressive. I don't think we give people credit for that. And so from my perspective, we need to take a step back. Would you talk to your grandma like that if she called and was confused about something the city was doing or your community was doing? No. Why? Because you care, because you have empathy. So when someone asks you a question from a different culture, from a different point of view, taking the time to listen and explain it to them like you would someone in your family.
Thank you, Cam. Yeah, great points. The tensions that exist are messy, right? Between people of different races, ethnicities, languages, but so too is diversity. So too is democracy. So too is this so-called American experiment. Yes, and things are changing, and a lot of people are struggling. I think especially white people are struggling with how things are changing and maybe changing very quickly. Christina, from your vantage point, the problems, the challenges,
Sure. So I think, there are some very clear, obvious ones that have kind of been touched on already, housing being one of them, labor conditions and fair wages being another, and beyond that, sort of thinking about how we as community members can engage with industrial, agricultural, transnational companies in ways that are productive for our communities, and hold them responsible for the necessities of the community in terms of infrastructure, social, and physical, right? But I think at a much more concrete level, we also have to think, well, before I go to the concrete, one more thing. Something that hasn't been mentioned yet explicitly that I think is important to remember is the role not just of xenophobia and racism, but specifically anti-Blackness. I think about Columbus Junction, for example, and I think about it's not an accident that the people who were recruited from urban Chicago, from Congo, from various different places in the world who self-identify as Black or African-American have not chosen to live there in large numbers over a long period of time. The people who work at the meatpacking plant who identify in that way often commute there from somewhere else. And I think we need to be really reflective about why that might be and what we could do to make our community more welcoming and overcome some of the anti-Blackness. And I include anti-Blackness from communities of color themselves, right? So from within the Asian community, from within the Latinx community. I think we really need to think hard about what that means for ourselves and our communities. But at a policy level, I see some really exciting things happening, movements toward municipal driver's license and municipal IDs, right, that already exist in places like Johnson County, but also movements to have, or against real ID, for example, and for driver's licenses, meaning that you know the rules of the road and how to drive, and not that you are necessarily a citizen or a permanent legal resident or whatever your status might be. And I think it's really important for rural communities to think about the impact that that can have on the positive impact that people having driver's licenses can have on their community. And so I find that, really exciting, and there's a lot of potential there, right? Bilingual programs, right? These bilingual, that's not to say that they're completely unproblematic in all ways, but bilingual programs where, people are empowered and literate and employable in multiple languages is fantastic. And I hope more communities look at those examples and say, what can we do to also make that happen in our community? Yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, well done. Okay, finally, before we turn to questions from the audience, so audience, start sorting out those questions. I'd like to ask one more important question. So Iowa's reputation as a place refugees and immigrants seek to call home, it does grow each year. Folks list things such as cost of living, affordability of housing, access to job opportunities, good schools, and I don't know how to feel about the so-called Iowa nice mentality. I think we've talked about the ways in which it veils racism and xenophobia as well. But Iowa nice, people are nice here. The Midwestern nice are all reasons that folks why they come and why they stay in our state. I do, to help make this point here, I want to share this article. I'm going to put it in the chat here. If you have a few minutes, do check it out. Read it. You'll see more of what I'm talking about, both in Iowa and in the Midwest more broadly. So in turn and briefly, what do you each think? How can policymakers across our state, and especially in Des Moines, look to Iowa's most diverse towns and often rural towns to help create new, welcoming, and inclusive policies? Kara, maybe I'll start with you, since you are a policymaker, a lawmaker, city council.
That is a challenge. And it will definitely continue to be a challenge until people can actually get out and, work with one another. the subtleties in discrimination and the veiled, Iowa nice that was spoken of earlier, definitely is embedded. And we see it here as well, with certain distinctions that we have within our cultures here in town, that there's clearly a line of demarcation between the cultures and how they group and how they celebrate and how they come together and not come together. But as far as policy goes, we have been trying to really be equitable with our economic development here in our community. We have a devoted economic development entity called We Lead, and the executive director has been fantastic in trying to assist all demographics in our community with programming, whether it's through our urban renewal grants that we enacted about 2 years ago to assist. It's a matching grant to assist with business owners, property owners, with revitalization of building fronts and facades, to helping with housing. Housing is the number one, I think, issue that a lot of communities in the state are having, and it's no different in West Liberty. We are in extreme need, a drought of housing, and that is something that we have to continue to move forward on. Just enabling more of the voices of the community to be heard, I think is extremely important. I know that as far as I go, and I could suggest maybe some of my fellow council people here in West Liberty, that the reaching out to community members is very much taken seriously. And we try and do that at all levels and try to respond to all community members that have questions. So I think it's important for, on the larger spectrum, to sort of take a note from this, our small town community, on how to really take a grassroots approach to appealing to the people and continuing to open those lines of communication. I think there's such a division there, because once you reach in the upper echelon hierarchy of government, communication, I think, just completely drops off. So that it just makes it much more difficult and distant for people to accept. And therefore, I think that leads to a lot of apathy. So I really think that engaging in our citizens in our state is really the number one, I guess, avenue, to take in communication. But I agree with a lot of the sentiments the fellow panelists have shared. We have a lot of those same issues too.
Thank you, Karen. Caleb, how can policymakers in Des Moines, how can they look to Iowa's most diverse towns to help create new, welcoming, and inclusive policies?
Well, first I'm going to say it's not Iowa nice, it's Iowa ice. And I can't take credit for that, but it's basically just cordial, say, hey, how are you doing? I don't really care about anything else. And like the previous comment, it really is community engagement. We can't continue to do community engagement as we've done the last 30 years. If you want people to come, and if you want people to talk, I can't just expect someone to come talk to me. Hey, I have great ideas. I want to hear yours. No, I've got to go to where those ideas are. And in Marshalltown, what is being done is Zamora's. Not only is it a grocery store with a fantastic burrito, but it's essentially a community center. So now if the city needs to do any community engagement, any outreach, we're going there and doing it. Because that family who owns it, they are leaders. If there are stories that when fundraisers ask for a pound of meat, they'll give 10. You know, they'll ask for a pinata, they'll give 3. This family really cares about the community, and the community knows that. They'll go there, they'll ask questions. And so going to the places in your community where people are already welcome, and being there and being a servant. I'm a public servant. And, you know, when I talked to my kids about it, when I did career fair or, you know, career day, I asked the students, the 3rd graders, what do you think a public servant is? And they had amazing answers. And then taking those answers and really embodying it. So when we're doing community engagement, I'm not just sending out a Google form or a form in their water bill that says, hey, I want your opinion in Google Translate in Spanish. It's going to where they are, going to the schools, going to the Latino grocery stores, going to the Asian grocery stores and talking, you know, and it might not be the best use of time from someone else's point of view, but if I'm there 3-4 hours and I have one good conversation where someone's like, oh, you know what, that's why this road's going to be closed, or, oh, yeah, I am interested in this development, or, hey, you know what, there's going to be a public meeting. I would really like to hear your input. I, as a planner, I can't expect people to come give me their opinions, and that never should have been the case. But it's how we've done it in this profession for years, and it's really getting out from behind the desk and going where people are. And to me, that's humbling yourself and showing that you don't know all the answers and that you're not a gatekeeper anymore. And that's the biggest thing that I can walk away from any conversation is, how can I not be a gatekeeper?
Thank you, Ken. Okay, we now move to the question and answer portion of our program. Please submit your questions via the chat function at the bottom of your viewing screen. Feel free to turn on your video function, but you will remain muted while we're waiting for questions to come in. ICFRC wants to thank its members and donors for their support to provide these free educational programs to our community. If you would like to join ICFRC or make a gift to support this project or others, please go to icfrc.org. Thank you. We'll wait for a moment to let those questions come in. Art, what should folks be reading to learn more? They should start with your book, of course, right? But the state is growing in diversity. I'm thinking, of course, about refugees and immigrants, about how our demographics are changing, how it impacts public policy. What should folks be reading?
Well, the Storm Lake Times pilot, for starters, www.stormlake.com. And if you want to see stories about immigrants and how isolated Northwest Iowa community is adapting to that rapid pace of change, and it is really rapid. That's what I would suggest reading, honestly. And it's kind of like dispatches from the battlefront. You were talking about policy. I think we can all agree that the main stabilizing agents for these immigrant communities are our public education systems, which were just allowed 2.5% growth on 8.5% inflation. And how are you supposed to hire teacher aides who are getting paid $12 an hour, by the way, and have no union representation? How are you supposed to teach these immigrant students how to speak English when English is the state's official language, thanks to Steve King? How do you expect to teach them English when you're giving them a 2.5% growth rate on an 8.5% inflation rate? And that's where I'd start with public policy. It all starts with education.
I couldn't agree with more. I'm an educator myself. It's where real change can happen and where minds can change. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Okay, we have some questions. Anissa asks, what approach did you take in providing the adequate housing for newly arrived refugees, Afghan refugees, most recent during this housing crisis? I don't know if any of you can speak to that question. There is a real, it's been pointed out, the housing crisis, but a real problem in housing refugees. Most folks are in hotels yet. This is serious problem. I don't know if anyone in the panel can speak to this.
Definitely we should hear from Caleb, but I would just say that I learned so much about the immigration system from living in places like Columbus Junction and helping people who are asylees and refugees. And the system is completely broken, even when you try to follow all the rules and do all the right things. For example, lots of people don't know that if you are a refugee, that you, it used to be that you got a lot more support from agencies, the state, the federal government. Today, if you are a refugee, you might owe several $1,000s to the United States government for your plane fare and be expected to pay that back within something like 6 to 12 months. So that means, you know, finding a place to live, having an address, learning the language, getting a job. And I think those expectations are pretty unrealistic and do not make people set people up for success wherever they choose to live. And so I think, you know, when we think about even the part of the process that works, definitely still doesn't work. And I think we need to be serious about that as community members, about what parts of that we can pick up and what parts of that we can't.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. There's a comment here that the link I put in. Many things have changed in the state of Iowa since the article was published. Boy, you're right about that. Please feel free to share one that is better, is updated. I would love to have that myself. That was one I had quick at the ready. So when you're reading it, be mindful that much has changed. I think it was done before the pandemic, so it's all old information in many ways. How can communities who are preparing to accept more immigrants and refugees learn from your town's experiences? Question from Kendall.
Come to Storm Lake or Marshalltown and talk to the police chief. The Storm Lake Police Department, you know, went to Marshalltown when they had a new police chief, and, you know, kind of helped. Was his name Joe something, Caleb?
The chief now is Chief Tupper, and he is really good. He
and Mark Prosser, the police chief here, worked a lot together in getting up to speed. And the Storm Lake School District goes around the state talking to people about how to adapt to immigrant enrollments. And so that's been happening for some time. And so, for example, Storm Lake students travel through Northwest Iowa to talk about racism because there is a lot of racism in Northwest Iowa. And so they're making a real difference. But the first thing I do is just go to one of these communities that's nearby and just talk to the police chief, talk to the city manager, talk to the school superintendent, or talk to somebody in the bar about it. That's how I'd learn.
You're so right about police chiefs. I did a panel for one of my classes. Really, it was just before the pandemic. And boy, did I learn so much from the Iowa City police chief. And I didn't just learn about what the police chief does. I learned about how he thinks, how he sees the bigger picture, and how he engages with the community. Like, oh, I'm really glad I live here after hearing the police chief talk. You know, it's not law enforcement, how you see law enforcement. It's not like that everywhere. Yes, the good source, police chiefs. Why, Deb asked, do Iowa politicians not speak out positively about immigration when so many immigrants are working on Iowa farms? Christina, is this one you can, as an anthropologist, maybe you can shed some insight here?
Sure. I mean, as an anthropologist, we always are looking for what are the power dynamics and sort of what do people get from these kinds of things. As a functionalist, that's what we call that, functionalism. Why would somebody do this, right? Certainly, it benefits them somehow, right? And one of those benefits typically is that if people are disempowered, then they are easier to exploit. And we can do that in various ways, right? Through lacks of various kinds, housing, healthcare access, labor conditions, all these kinds of things. And so I think, sort of, I guess the flip answer is follow the money. But also I think we have forgotten that solidarity doesn't just happen by itself. We have to make it happen, right? We have to say, these, when somebody says, oh, we should deport all these Mexicans, or there are too many Latinos here, or whoever it is, right? That we have to not just say individually that that's not a good idea, but we have to say collectively, no, that's not acceptable. These aren't just random unhuman others. They are my family, my neighbors, my children, my spouse, my parents. These are people who I care very much about, and they have, the human rights that we all aspire to live with. And I think that some of our politicians have lost sight of that a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. It is extremely difficult right now to achieve, the serendipitous relationship. But here in West Liberty, we have had many years of actually Carolyn Colvin from the University of Iowa's College of Education has been coming to West Liberty to help offer programming at the elementary school here after hours in the evenings for adult learners or learning English, adult Spanish speakers trying to maneuver through the system by helping with citizenship or helping learning English or what have you. So we've had that ability to engage somewhat with the Spanish speaking or the non-English speaking community in that regard. But when you're bringing new immigrants into town as a workforce like West Liberty Foods is, it is a challenge, and primarily they have taken on the responsibility of trying to allocate housing for that workforce and working with the city and other surrounding communities to get housing, even if it's temporary until they can move into a more permanent situation. That is a huge challenge. But we are a small community. I think that's to our benefit because we do allow for us to work on a more intimate level here with one-on-one with people. So maybe that is something that is, as was discussed earlier, abundant hope in the heartland for our community, and that maybe, as time goes, those individuals who are new or relatively new will be able to grow their voice in our community.
Yeah, I mean, I do wonder if that would be an easy write-off, right? Especially for folks in Des Moines. Well, obviously I can't spend time one-on-one with my constituents. I can't do all these, go there and do this. But I mean, maybe the opposite isn't working either. And there are ways in which one can engage and be more intentional about who we engage with, how much time we spend with them, the openness with which we receive their ideas and their criticism. Yeah, more of it happening.
Can I just jump on that and affirm that? And also sort of, I know we don't have very much time left, but throw in there that it's important, particularly from a policy perspective, but also just as a community member, to remember to kind of flip the power dynamic in your head anytime that we're thinking about these relationships between community members, and say, is that whole personal responsibility thing really working out here, right? Because what happens is that we end up asking the community members with the least resources, the least experience with formal education, the least amount of time, et cetera, to deal with the hugest burden of doing life, right? And so I think about people who are like, oh, why don't they learn English? And well, you've had the same 30 years to learn Spanish or Chin or French or Arabic. So, to really be conscious of what is that power dynamic and who are we asking to do what and with what resources.
Thank you, Christina. I'm going to end, there's a note in here from one of our attendees. We're not able to unmute you, but I do want to read aloud a note that's been shared with me about refugee IOM travel loans that maybe is not correct. Refugees do need to pay back their travel loans, but in many instances they are forgiven, and refugees are given generous extensions to pay them back. I thank you for that comment in the audience. Very good. We all, we get a lot right, but sometimes we can use the collective to keep us on track. Thank you. Yes, I agree. This has been a valuable hour and a half. I'm grateful to all of you for spending time with us. So we now conclude our program. I want to give a big thank you to our Cullen, Caleb Knudsen, Kara McFerrin, and Christina Ortiz for sharing their expertise and time with us. I am honored to virtually present each of you with ICFRC's highly coveted mug for coffee, tea, or the beverage of your choice. We will coordinate delivery details with you very soon. This is ICFRC's last program for the spring semester. If you have missed any of our programs, you can view them online at our website, icfrc.org, or City Channel 4 archives. We will be in contact via email about future programs, and we will also be seeking your advice about future program topics. On a personal note, I am grateful to all of our attendees in this series, Refugees and Immigrants in Iowa. It has been impactful. You have all, and the attendees too, with your fabulous questions, shaped and reshaped, have pushed me to think differently. And I hope that this continues, these conversations continue to ripple out and inform others, so that we might, sooner rather than later, have a more welcoming and inclusive state. So thank you to all of you. We are adjourned.